a long-ago Coney Island amusement park that existed from 1904 until its destruction by fire in 1911, which is to say the thing that I mostly talk about on this channel, was a reflection of its time, and many of the aspects of that time that it reflected were not great. Case in point, in 1908, the park was host to a new attraction called Freak Street, which was a stretch of the concourse showcasing a number of human oddities, dwarfs, giants, conjoined twins, purported Aztecs, heavy quotations on that, folks with no legs, that sort of thing. And in 1908, that wouldn't have raised many eyebrows, the freak show having been an accepted part of circuses, carnivals, fairs, and even lofty-minded events like the World's Columbian Exposition that were supposedly dedicated to elevating the culture as a whole. There's not a lot of information about Freak Street itself, so for this and probably the next few episodes, I'm instead going to be talking about the context of the attraction, where the freak show came from, the values that it embodied, etc., and showcasing a few of the people who either may have been portrayed on the street itself, or paved the way for those who were. And also, I'm just going to tell weird, disturbing stories that I find fascinating and that I can't stop thinking about. So, today, we'll be going back about 70 years before Dreamland existed to talk a bit about the man who had a great deal of influence on the early 20th century freak show, Hugh Jackman. I mean P.T. Barnum, as well as the very first person he ever exhibited, Joyce Heth. Before we get going here, could you do me a favor and leave a like down below? It helps out this tiny little channel with the YouTube algorithm and all that. All hail the YouTube algorithm. As well as giving me important proof that, like, hey, people out there are actually watching this. So I'll get to Barnum in a minute here, but I want to start by looking at the word itself. Freak. It's not a terribly nice way to refer to someone, and I won't be using it that way except in the form of the phrase freak show, because that's kind of unavoidable when you're talking about something called Freak Street as the framing device for your YouTube video. But I won't be using it for the people who were exhibited. But what does it mean anyway? Like, where did it come from? Well, it first shows up in English in the 16th century, and originally it referred to a capricious notion, or a sudden change in thought, usually without any apparent cause. Like, you're talking to your mother about a family get-together, and all of a sudden you think to yourself, wonder if that wolf guy from the cantina scene in Star Wars has a name and a backstory. That is a freak in the original sense. The answer is yes, by the way. His name is Lac Sivrak, and there are about 50,000 words describing him on Wikipedia, because of course there are. Okay, a freak was originally an errant thought. A freak of nature, then, is nature itself getting distracted from its design and producing something different. A person who is smaller than average, say, or a set of twins whose bodies did not quite separate in the womb. And then, obviously, a showcase for such cases would be a freak show. And that's a value judgment. A freak, according to this etymology, is irregular, anomalous, incorrect. So, you see why the term's a slur. So much for the word. Most of us have an idea in our heads when we picture the freak show. That image comes from the exhibitions of the 19th century and early 20th. And the grandfather of the freak show, as we typically imagine it, was the man himself, Wolverine. I mean P.T. Barnum. I know I already made that joke, but I wanted to include a clip of Wolverine, so I had to make it again. Now, it's debatable if what Barnum did could be considered a freak show, in the way most of us picture. But he certainly paved the way for them, and patient zero for his particular variety of entertainment, I guess, was a woman named Joyce Heth. Barnum was a complex figure, and there's plenty written about him, many videos right here on YouTube about him. I'd recommend you check out some of the ones produced by the Barnum Museum of Connecticut. They do a good job, and they need some love. And of course, Oscar-nominated musical The Greatest Showman, which, according to a review of the film on RogerEbert.com, shows Barnum as having an, quote, inclusive delight in the parade of humanity before him, and that he was a good person who helped ignored people really be seen. But was he such a person? And did his exhibitions accomplish that altruistic and musical-worthy goal? Certainly not at the start, because Barnum's first exhibition, which made his initial fortune and which you won't see in Disney's whitewashed version of the story, was dark and cynical as hell. From this point on, please note that I will be discussing topics like slavery, medical abuse, racism, ableism, and overall exploitation. Joyce Heth was an elderly enslaved woman who was first exhibited by two men, neither of whom were Barnum, in 1835. It's unclear where the story came from, but by the time she attracted Barnum's attention, she was promoted as over 160 years old and as having served as nursemaid to George Washington himself. Her owners at that time were having trouble getting their money's worth from showing her and were looking to unload. Barnum, at that time, owned a general store, but Heth's exploiters talked him into buying her, assuring him that he would make his fortune.
Congratulations, Mr. Barnum. You, sir, are now a slaveholder.
Only there was one problem. In New York, slavery was outlawed back in 1827, so this planned transaction was utterly illegal as well as immoral. Barnum, exhibiting the willingness and ability to bend the truth, which he would later become famous for, managed to find a loophole. Instead of buying her outright, he would instead lease her for 1 year for $1,000, about $35,000 in today's money. Apparently, in the eyes of the law, buying a slave is illegal, but leasing a person is fine. Sadly, Heth's own story and viewpoint is lost in this tale of Barnum's birth as a showman. We can't know what she thought of all this, but given that she was definitely in her 80s at least, and blind as well as paralyzed, we can only imagine that working 10 to 12 hours per day, pretending she'd been owned by a US founding father, probably wasn't the life she would have chosen for herself. But hey, let's do the fair thing, and not cast aspersions on Barnum. Let's take a look at how he described working with Joyce. After all, he became an abolitionist later in life. Maybe we will find out that he was super sympathetic toward her, and that I'm kind of mischaracterizing him here.
She had led an easy life of it. She by no means relished the idea of having her old bones trotted around the country from one extremity to the other, without much of rest or ceremony.
Well, that doesn't seem so kind. Let's take a look at another passage.
The winch, upon which I built my principal hopes of fortune, was a remarkably old-looking animal. Having been bedridden for 12 years, and so wrinkled and shriveled and drawn up by disease that her appearance indicated great longevity, but I made her look a great deal older. I extracted her teeth, which caused her cheeks to sink in.
Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. Barnum began exhibiting Joyce at Niblo's Garden, a theater in New York, in August of 1835, and traveled with her for the next 7 months. During shows, she would sing hymns and tell stories from Little George's childhood. The exhibit was extremely popular, and Barnum's investment paid off, and he earned approximately $1,500 a week, $43,000 in today's money. How much did Heth or her family make off of this? Well, none. Barnum was making money for himself, and he was certainly not going to do anything more than the bare minimum for a slave. Even worse, in Barnum's original autobiography, he recounted how he had responded to criticisms from abolitionist preachers in Rhode Island.
In my pamphlet of the life of the illustrious Joy, I had stated that she'd been a slave, and that her family were slaves. This was a great point for the priest. They preached most fervently against the abomination of citizens giving their money to a creature whose family were slaves. My attendance fell off. Well, I know how to fix them. I resolved to turn the tables on them. I told them one and all, the object of the exhibition was to enfranchise them, that all the money collected by the exhibition of Joyce went to this glorious purpose. The ministers now preached in favor of it. They exhorted their congregations to go. My exhibition room was crowded. Emancipation and Blarney carried all before them, and I pocketed the rhino. Viva la humbug.
The whole affair didn't last long. Joyce was, after all, very old and quite ill. On February 19th, 1836, the inevitable happened, and Joyce Heth passed away. But Barnum wasn't quite done with her yet. One of his ways of attracting visitors to pay to see Joyce Heth while she was alive was to plant stories in local newspapers claiming that she was not a real human being, but rather an automaton made from India rubber and whalebone. He'd usually do this after the initial crowds had begun to slow down in order to get folks to return to see her in order to judge for themselves whether she was real or if they'd been tricked previously, and it worked a treat. While she was breathing, anyway. But Barnum wanted one last crowd, so he announced that he would be proving once and for all that she was both a real person and 161 years old. How would he do this?
I had only to consider how much I might make out of her remains. The doctor advised me to get a large room and charge 50 cents admission to witness the dissection, which I did.
Public autopsy, which he would perform at a saloon. And he'd charge 50 cents admission. So 1 week after her death, Joyce Heth was publicly autopsied at the City Saloon in Lower Manhattan. Dr. David Rogers talked the audience through the process and determined that yes, she was a person, despite how she'd been treated over the years. But she was most probably only around 80 years old rather than 160, and that took her out of the running for George Washington's nursemaid. Now, you may think that Barnum would have to own up to his con at this point, but no. Barnum immediately told the assembled crowd that, he tricked them yet again. This wasn't Joyce Heth, but a woman from Harlem named Aunt Nellie who was autopsied, and that the real Joyce Heth, who was 160 years old, was currently touring Europe.
Got him. He's got pranked. He's got pranked.
So, in the end, Joyce Heth didn't even have the dignity of having her own name when she finally passed away. Of course, it eventually became clear that the real Joyce Heth had been autopsied on the table. Barnum, in his autobiography, stated that he was shocked to discover that Heth wasn't the oldest person who ever lived.
Well, not that shocked.
And, in a final insult, even insinuated that it was she who had swindled him. He was just her victim. So what do we take away from this? Number one, Barnum was a monster? I mean, how else do I interpret this? Like I said, he became an abolitionist later in life and a strong supporter of Lincoln and the Union, but reading these early remarks by him on Joyce Heth, not to mention the fact of her exploitation, well, draw your own conclusions. At some point, I hope to revisit this topic and be able to get a fuller picture of Barnum and just who he was when he was exhibiting Heth. But for now, his words will have to speak for themselves. Back to Dreamland. What can this tell us about Freak Street, which opened on the Coney Island concourse some 70 years later? Well, Barnum's story includes two elements that come up again and again in the history of human oddities in the sideshow: hucksterism, creating a story about your performer in order to make their otherness even more exotic, and exploitation, the wishes of the performers themselves often, by no means always, but often, were not accounted for by the exhibitor. And this could be very easy because the society of this era in America had already put these folks at the bottom rung, so to speak, whether because of their physical deformities, their race, their status as a slave, or their mental development. So ends our first stop on Freak Street. And in conclusion, I'm glad The Greatest Showman didn't win an Oscar. Oh hey, did you find this interesting, if utterly dispiriting? Do you want more tales to crush your soul and all your hope for humanity? Do you enjoy musicals getting ruined by aging Gen Xers? Then subscribe below, and if you're really into this strange old stories from the ancient entertainment world, you can also sign up at my Patreon, where you will get early access to these videos, as well as my profound thanks. Patreon.com/Ty Bannerman. Until next time, thank you for meeting me in Dreamland. I'm being attacked by a fly. Oh my god. But Barnum wasn't... Go away.